Hello fellow stackers. I've hit you with a lot of theory over the past few weeks. Now I'm going to give you something practical. I'm going to give you a very simple strategy for significantly accelerating the growth of your hoard. There is no market timing involved. All that's required is an appreciation for the historical value of gold and silver against oil, and a willingness to trade one metal for the other based upon a judgment of which one is cheaper relative to the other. Take a look at this chart. If you watched my other videos, it will be very familiar to you. It shows how many barrels of oil can be bought for 1 ounce of gold or 50 ounces of silver. As can be seen, there are times when 1 ounce of gold or 50 ounces of silver could buy as much as 25 barrels of oil or as little as 10 barrels of oil. But most of the time, the metals are somewhere in between. Note that there are times, such as the early 90s, when gold can buy more oil than silver can. During these periods of time, a preference should be given to accumulating silver. There are other times, such as the 70s, when silver can purchase more oil than gold. During these times, a preference should be given to accumulating gold. Let's take a look at a few simple rules based upon these observations, or what I call stacking policies, and see how they would have worked out for the hypothetical saver over the past 50 years. So here's policy number 1. This is just a simple mechanical accumulation policy, and it will serve as a baseline. Starting at the beginning of our roughly 45-year period, we'll have our investor buy 1 ounce of gold per month. This may be more or less than what you personally would be able to afford, but you can modify this strategy to fit your budget by either making the purchases bigger or smaller, or by spacing the purchases out differently in time. So what would the end result be for this investor? At the end, he would have spent a little over $234,000 and accumulated 546 ounces of gold. The average price would have been $429 per ounce. If the investor's real interest was to accumulate silver, then at the end, he could very simply exchange all of that gold for silver and would have a little over 34,000 ounces of silver for the net cost of $6.85 per ounce. Of course, this neglects trading spreads. In reality, the investor would forfeit a portion of his stack in making this exchange, but just to keep things simple, let's ignore the spread. For you silver lovers, let's modify our baseline policy number 1, and instead of our investor purchasing 1 ounce of gold per month, let's have him buy 50 ounces of silver regardless of price. At the end of the 45-year period, he would have spent a little over $227,000 and would have accumulated 27,300 ounces of silver for a net effective cost of $8.32 per ounce. If he decided at the end of this period to exchange all of that silver for gold, he would have 435 ounces of gold for a net effective cost of $522 per ounce. Again, this ignores the large spread on silver, so in reality the investor would have between 5 and 10% less gold than the 435 ounces. But again, let's ignore that for the sake of simplicity. So let's get a little smarter about this. Instead of buying a fixed amount of metal every month, let's buy more when it's cheap relative to oil, and less when it's expensive. This can be done by using the price of oil to determine the amount of dollars of metal to purchase. All policies from this point forward will have our investor purchase 17.5 barrels worth of oil in metal every month. So for example, if the price of oil is $90 per barrel, the investor would multiply $90 by 17.5, which would tell him to buy $1,575 worth of metal in that month. So policy number 3 will have our investor buy 17.5 barrels worth of oil in gold every month. If he did this over 45 years of our study, he would have spent a little over $273,000, which is reasonably close to the amount spent for policies number 1 and number 2. He would have accumulated about 670 ounces of gold for a net effective price of $408 per ounce. So immediately we can see that his cost basis was 5% lower than it was for policy number 1, which called for purchasing a fixed amount of gold every month. If he wanted to trade all of his gold for silver at the end of the period, he could certainly do so. The result of doing so is shown in this slide. Again, for you silver-oriented stackers, we can modify policy 3 for silver accumulation. So for policy number 4, let's have our investor buy 17.5 barrels worth of oil in silver every month. At the end of the 45-year period, he would have spent the same $273,000 and would have accumulated 33,667 ounces of silver for a net effective price of $8.13. This is a better result than policy 2 of just buying 50 ounces of silver every month, but only by a couple of percent. Okay, We've seen that by varying the size of our purchases every month based upon the price of oil, we can lower our cost basis. Let's see what happens when we decide each month with which metal to buy based upon which one is cheaper. So for policy number 5, our investor will buy the 17.5 barrels worth of oil in metal each month, just as before, but if gold is expensive, he will buy silver, and if silver is expensive, he will buy gold. In the end, he has spent the same $273,000. If he converts all of his metal holdings at the end to gold, he will have 789 ounces of gold for a net price of $347 per ounce. If he converts it all to silver, he will have 42,603 ounces for a net effective price of $6.42 per ounce. Finally, we'll assume that our investor is willing to exchange gold for silver based upon which one is cheaper. So for policy number 6, we'll do just that. He'll still buy 17.5 barrels worth of whichever metal is less expensive every month, but now, when the gold to silver ratio rises above 50, he'll exchange all of his gold for silver, and when it falls below 50, he'll trade all of his silver for gold. As before, he still spent $273,000. If at the very end he converts his entire stack to gold, he will have 925 ounces worth of gold for a net effective price of $296 per ounce. If he converts it all to silver, he will have 58,034 ounces for a net effective price of $4.72 per ounce. By now, the advantage of a relative pricing approach should be readily apparent. Just the same, let's visually display the end result of each one of these stacking policies and see just how well each one would have worked out. So let's compare the results of simply accumulating a fixed quantity of one metal or the other against using a relative pricing as a guide for how to build our stack. On the top, we show the various ways that we could have accumulated gold. Policy number 1 has us buy an ounce per month for 45 years. Our cost would have been $429 per ounce over that period. If instead we had adopted the policy of buying based upon the relative price versus oil, had always purchased the metal that was cheaper, and traded our stack back and forth on the few times that one became more expensive than the other, our cost basis for gold would have been $296 per ounce. These results would have been roughly the same whether our investor bought a large amount every month or a small amount. So we can see that our cost basis, using a simple pricing strategy, would have been 31% lower than it would have been if we had bought a fixed amount of gold per month. In other words, given the resources at our disposal, we would be able to accumulate 31% more metal over time. The same goes for silver, but even more so. Over time, if we had bought a fixed amount of silver each month, it would have cost us $8.32 per ounce. If instead we incorporated gold and traded back and forth, we could have lowered the cost basis by 43% to $4.72 per ounce. In other words, in the end, you would have roughly twice the amount of metal than you otherwise would have. This is the basic advantage of not being a one metal only kind of investor. I've made it clear to people that I've interacted with in this community that my own personal goal is to accumulate gold, but that I will buy silver as well. This illustrates the reason why. By accumulating silver when it is inexpensive and converting it to gold later, I've been able to increase my gold stack at a much faster pace with the resources that I've had at my disposal. So whether you're a gold stacker or a silver stacker, please consider the possible benefits of using the other metal to your advantage. I think over time, you'll be glad that you did.